Well, good evening. It is good to see everyone this evening. Glad that we can be together and continue our study that we've been going through. I hope that for those of y'all who have been reading, that it helped out to skip a week, because I know that sometimes with everything going on, I know for me, when I have something to read, it helps out when I have a little bit of extra time to get some stuff done. But even if you haven't read, don't worry, because we're just looking at some principles from the first chapter tonight, so we're not that far into the book as of yet anyway. As I've said many times, I do encourage you to get the book, but that being said, we're not going to be following the book word for word as we go through. I think that the overall concepts can be best understood if you have the book and as we're going through, but I'm going to be pulling from kind of several different concepts as we move through our lessons, because I think that will be the most helpful for us. Kind of like, for example, if you've ever seen a movie that was adapted from a book, well, they're never identical, and there's a reason for that, because what works in a movie doesn't always work in a book and vice versa, and so same thing with us for this. So if you remember last time, not last week, but last time, we talked about the idea of gardening, and we were just looking, for the last couple times that we've talked about this, we've been looking at some basic concepts, really just out of like the introduction to the book, that kind of will introduce us to some things that will be helpful as we move through. So last time in particular, we looked at the idea that I don't have to be the one who harvests, meaning I don't have to be the one who closes the deal, who sees the person that I'm working with obey the gospel. And I don't have to rush towards that goal if it means that I am taking shortcuts where I don't need to make shortcuts. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't a sense of urgency. That doesn't mean I drag my feet. That means if I can help someone get closer, and that's the best they can do for right now, where they're at, I've done my job. And all of us can do that. Not all of us may be closers, quote unquote, but all of us can help someone get a little bit further along their way to understanding the truth of the gospel. So now we're going to get into the first kind of big topic that we can talk about from the book. This is similar to the title, not quite the title, but similar to the title of the first chapter. And a lot of what he talks about, as I said, we'll be looking at that's talked about in this first chapter. We're going to look at this idea of tactical diplomacy. Now, of course, you notice the word tactical is in there. Again, that's not actually how he describes it in his initial thing, but I wanted to use that title because we're talking about the right kind of diplomacy. And what we mean by that is this. Think about this passage. We're told by Peter that we as Christians were to be always prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you. It's a high calling, right? That's a demanding requirement of us. But I want us to ask a question as we think about this starting out this evening. What comes to mind when you hear people talk about defending their faith, giving a defense for their faith? What comes to mind? What scenes play out in your mind when you hear that kind of phrase? If you've had to picture what that looks like, what comes to mind? Do what? Okay. Okay, good. So a lot of times we might picture something in kind of a debate format. That's certainly one aspect that we might see. I think recently over at Faulkner University, I believe Kyle Butt debated, if you all know who that is, he does a lot of debates. He debated like an atheist or something like that on like the existence of God or something like that. So that's one way that we kind of think of maybe. What else? What else do we think of when we think of defending our faith? Do what? Defending our faith. What do you have there?
I think of whenever like somebody's trying to tempt you to do something that you know is wrong, and you tell them, I don't do that.
Okay, good. That's a lot of times the scenario for us personally, right, on a day-to-day basis. We're not necessarily going to stand up in front of a crowd and say, this is why I believe in God, but in a personal way, someone tries to get me to do something, and I say, I'm not going to do that, and here's why. That's certainly one way. Yes, very good. What else? What comes to mind?
I thought about those little snarky remarks sometimes.
In what context?
Well, you think you're the only one's going to be heaven.
Okay. Okay, so kind of ways that we feel attacked and we feel like we have to push back. Yeah, you think you're the only ones going to heaven, or you don't believe in music, or the things that often get thrown away. Good, good. What else? Any other thoughts? Any other things come to mind? What about the word defense? What does that bring to mind? Okay. Okay, good. Being on the defensive, feeling like I have to defend. Even we might extend it. I mean, I'm playing a board game that I found recently. Right now I'm playing it with myself so that I can understand the rules and teach lists. But, do what? Yeah, I'm going to win that one. That is very good. There's an attacker and a defender in certain circumstances when there's like a combat in the thing, right? Defense a lot of times implies a battle, right? The point of all these ideas that we're putting out there, and everyone is right on the money, a lot of times when we talk about defending our faith, especially when we think about passages like 1 Peter 3, a lot of times what comes to mind is a very combative type atmosphere. Whether it's someone coming to us being combative and we feel like we have to defend ourselves, whether it's us feeling like we need to stand up and go on the offensive sometimes. Best defense is good offense, right? With things going on in our world, we need to, say, no, this is wrong. Whether it be, people who are really trying to attack the church, and so we feel like we have to attack back. A lot of times, our concept of defending our faith it has a specific kind of connotation that comes with it. Now, let's think about that for a moment. Are there times, let's use Jesus as our example, because he's the best one we got, right? And he's the perfect one we got. Jesus, whenever he was challenged, were there times where he shot back very forcefully? Oh, you better believe it, right? I mean, the one that comes to mind was at Matthew 23. He just goes to town on the Pharisees, right? He just, one after another, you hypocrites, this is what you do. You hypocrites, how dare, very much just on the attack, a very combative environment. Is that always how he defended the truth, though? No. And we see, and we've talked about this many times before, we see that his approach, in large part, depended on who he was engaging in defending the truth. Sometimes he was engaging people who should have known better, people who were very publicly attacking him. Sometimes he was engaging people who were protesting out of ignorance, not out of ill will. The reason I say that is this: not every situation where we are defending our faith has to be a combative situation. This statement, and I think this is just about a quote, this is a slight variation, I think, actually, on his quote in the book, but this statement, let's talk about this for a second. When we're talking about a personal exchange, now we're not talking about, if I'm up in front of a group of people. We're talking about me and someone else having a conversation. They don't agree with something about Scripture or God or whatever, and so we're having this conversation about it. If I get mad, I lose. If they get mad, I lose. Let's think about that. Is that true? And if so, or if not, why?
No one ever wins a debate.
Okay. Why? Very good. If they get mad in the course of this discussion, again, remember, we're talking about a one-on-one discussion here. If the person I'm trying to help see the truth gets mad, they're not going to listen. I mean, those of y'all who have either been married or interacted with your parents, at least, right? Everyone's had at least that experience. What happens when the person you're arguing with gets angry? Usually you got to kind of, okay, let's calm down and then come back to this, right? Because everyone stops listening in the process. People don't change their minds when they're angry. Now that's if they get mad. What about if I get mad? Why do I lose if I get mad? For one thing, why would they listen to me when I'm angry about it, right? I mean, which would you rather do? Have a conversation with someone who is just having a conversation, or have a conversation with someone who you can tell is angry at you? I don't really want to sit there and listen to someone who's angry at me. Not only that, let's think about this as well. Let's, again, be sure we're going back to Jesus. Were there times where Jesus got angry? Were there times where people got angry at Jesus? So does that contradict what we're talking about here? Why not? Okay, good. Okay, good. Okay. Very good. Let's think about the times Jesus gets angry, number one. When does Jesus get angry? What's the setting that Jesus gets angry in? When we see him get angry. The turning the tables over is a good example. Matthew 23, of course, as we just talked about, is a good example. What's the setting when Jesus gets angry? Okay, good. For one thing, people already aren't listening. At least the people that he's angry at are already not listening. They've shown themselves to have, what should we say, ulterior motives in the discussion. What else? What else is different? Okay, they're usually baiting him. Are those circumstances usually one-on-one discussions? Now, y'all correct me if I'm wrong. I don't remember a single time where Jesus having a one-on-one with someone and gets angry in the process. Again, y'all correct me if I'm wrong. He gets angry when essentially there's someone who knows better trying to put him in a difficult spot, trying to trip him up, again, having ulterior motives, and he gets angry and acts accordingly, again, sometimes turning the tables, sometimes, very much throwing his zinger back at him of, hey, no, you don't know what you're talking about. To make a point to the people watching, because it's not a one-on-one. It's a very different situation. What about when people get mad at him? Did Jesus do what was right in those situations? Well, it's Jesus. Obviously, yes, right? That's a given. Did Jesus do what's right? Yes. Was he successful? No. Understand what I'm saying? What's his goal? What's Jesus' goal? What does he say his goal is? His goal is to seek and save the lost. His goal is to get people to listen to the truth. Was he successful in that goal when people got mad at him and tried to throw him off the cliff? Let's just use that example. No. That actually proves our point. Now, that wasn't his fault that they got mad, but he lost. Again, he didn't do anything wrong. He lost because of their free will choosing not to listen. But he did everything he could in that particular time to get them to understand the truth. So this is something that we need to keep in mind here. Are there times where people are going to get mad, where there's going to be anger involved in the kind of conversations we're going to be having with people? Yes, let's be realistic. But my goal is always to minimize that chance, if possible. At least based on what I'm doing. Now, if they get mad because I have presented the truth in a loving manner, showing that I care for them, showing, even as we talked about this morning, that I'm trying to relate to them and all those kind of things, and if they still get mad, I can't control that. Now, that's still probably going to derail the discussion. That's still probably them saying, I'm not going to listen. But my goal, as much as is within me, without ever compromising truth, is to try and keep us from getting mad. Is to try and keep us from going to the battle stage, if you will. We're talking about diplomacy here. When do you have diplomacy happening between two sides? Now we're thinking like kingdoms and nations and all that kind of stuff. When does diplomacy happen? There's something that has to be resolved, right? Diplomacy doesn't exist for the times when everyone's on the same page. The whole point of diplomacy is we're trying to resolve something. So diplomacy doesn't mean there's no conflict. But which is better? Going to war or settling something through diplomacy? Right? Now, of course, we're mixing metaphors a little bit here because in the grand scheme of things, this is a war. We understand that. But in terms of one-on-one interactions, I can be much more effective by trying to work through diplomacy than by trying to unload a machine gun in the guy, figuratively speaking, right? One is going to be much more effective than the other. I may be able to win an argument. You can ask Liz. If I had put my heart into it, I can usually win arguments, right? That's just how my mind works. And that usually doesn't accomplish much. Growing up, I was really good at winning arguments with my parents. It usually didn't accomplish a whole lot, right? When I talk with someone who doesn't know the truth, I can win the argument, but what am I trying to accomplish? Well, the end goal, hopefully, is to save the soul. Or at least, as we talked about with the gardening, to get them closer to that goal than they were before. So I need to try as much as possible. If I lose, if someone gets mad, I need to try and be as diplomatic as I can in this process. Let's go back to another scripture. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. Now, it's interesting. In context, he's not talking about my interaction with my brother and sister in Christ. He's talking about my interactions with those outside. Let your speech always be gracious. In other words, favorable. I'm trying to communicate in a way that shows I am favorably disposed towards others. That is, I want to have a good relationship with them, and that they can also have a favorable view of me. This is an extreme that we probably mentioned before as an example, but there have been times, just saying it like it is, there have been times people in the name of being Christians have thrown bacon grease on Muslims. They don't believe in eating pork, right, or having anything to do with pork. And then when they get, attacked for it, they said, oh, I'm being persecuted as a Christian. Stupid, okay? That's just stupid. But even in a lesser sense, that's what he's talking about here. He's saying, as much as possible, don't give anyone any reason not to view you favorably. And he also says the seasoned with salt, right? I can say something and it not be well thought out. I can say something and, to kind of build on this metaphor, it leave a bad taste in someone's mouth, even if it's true. The point of this verse that Paul is saying here is not the content of what's being said. It's how I say it. That's key here. I still need to be telling the truth. I still need to be trying to get the person from where they are to where they need to be. But how I do it is very important. Our goal, ultimately, in this conversation, as we are having these interactions with people, that's really what we're talking about as we go through this book and this series of lessons. Our goal, ultimately, we're trying to steer the conversation where it needs to go. We're trying to get in the driver's seat of the conversation and steer it where it needs to go, because we, as we talked about even this morning, we have been blessed to know the truth. And they need to know that truth. So we are the ones who, whether they realize it or not, need to direct the conversation towards truth. But there's a big difference between trying to stay in the driver's seat and steer it the direction it needs to go and just laying into the person, beating them over the head with the truth, and then hoping that they get up and rub their bruises and say, oh, I want to follow the guy who just beat me down. We're going to talk about a conversation that is given to us in the first chapter. I have the book up here with me because I'm going to have to probably reference it a little bit. I don't want to misquote how this conversation pans out. But it's a very, very instructive conversation that kind of illustrates this approach of diplomacy, if you will. So as he's going through, I believe where is is he? He's at a store, yeah. He's at a store. And he happens to notice, as he's going through the checkout line, yeah, the lady in the checkout who's checking him out, she has a pentagram, like a necklace, a pentagram necklace. It looks something like this, is generally what a pentagram like is being described here looks like. Anyone know what this is? Or what it typically is associated with? Witches. Now, we think of that, and especially in our area, we don't have much exposure to this. If you go to places like Washington and Oregon, even in our own country, you will encounter this a lot. This is a real thing. This isn't, witches like Disney. This is a very real religion that exists. It's Wicca, basically, is what often is associated with. It is a earth-based pagan-type religion that focuses on, the powers that be in Mother Earth and all these kind of things. I'm going to butcher it if I try and give too much of an explanation of it. But that's what this refers to. Well, the author, he sees this, and he recognizes, hey, this is something that stands out. This is a way I can start a conversation. Going back to what we talked about this morning, common ground, right? He finds something they can both talk about as a starting point. So he asks her, he just simply asks her, and I'm going to paraphrase some of these things, so bear with me on that, but he just simply asks her, that necklace you're wearing, is that just a jewelry, or does it have some kind of religious significance for you? Very non-accusatory question, right? He's genuinely curious about her life, just making conversation, but in a way that's talking about something that's important to her. And she answers him in a very, cordial way. She says, oh yeah, it's religious. It represents earth, wind, fire, air, and spirit, I think is what the 5 things are. She says, I'm a pagan. That is what they call themselves, by the way. Now, the author's wife kind of chuckles at that, and she has to correct herself. It's like, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend by chuckling. I've never heard that word used in anything but a negative context. Get in here, you pagans, right? But the author continues. He recognizes there's a chance here. There's a opening for a conversation. Now, the first thing he doesn't do, notice, you're a pagan. Well, I hope that you correct that before you are eternally lost. Are pagans going to heaven if they don't change? But is that going to be helpful to say that? Okay. So, instead, he says, okay, so based on this description that you've given, and she had told him a little more. I think she said, like, all life is precious or something like that. He asks if she's a Wiccan specifically to make sure that he understands where she's coming from. And she says, yes, we believe all life is precious. We are very focused on, kind of like what the Native Americans did, this kind of being at one with nature and stuff like that. He says, okay. Now he has more to go on, right? Because he's learned more information about her and what she believes. So then he proceeds to ask her, just a chance, right, to use what information he has to try and put a rock in her shoe, if you will, about something that maybe she hasn't thought about. So he asked her, he says, so you believe all life is precious, so you must be pro-life in terms of the abortion issue. She says, no, actually, I'm pro-choice. He says, really? Well, that's interesting. Isn't that unusual for someone to be a Wiccan who cares about all life and yet be pro-choice when it comes to abortion? And her response is very interesting. She responds, she says, you're right, it is kind of odd. She says, I personally know I couldn't do that. I couldn't kill a baby. But I do think that is, something that I believe is true. Again, I'm kind of paraphrasing here. But I couldn't do it because I feel like it would come back on me. Now, you notice what she just did. How did he describe the issue? How did he describe the abortion issue? Do what? He described it as abortion, and he described it as, with the normal words, right? Pro-choice, pro-life. No one's really going to get upset with those things. Those are the normal terms that we use. For example, if I talk to someone and I say that, you're anti-life, or if someone talks to me and says, oh, you're anti-abortion, well, well, that carries a different stigma to it, right? So he uses very neutral terms to describe the positions. What did she do? She says, oh, I could never kill a baby. He didn't do that. Okay? That's very important here. He didn't describe abortion as baby killing. Now, does he know and do we know that's what we're talking about? Sure. But she's the one who describes that. He, based on what she has said, now is going to continue the conversation, making sure he's only using descriptions she's comfortable with. She just said baby killing, so now he's never going to use the word abortion again. He's going to describe it the way she described it. And that's okay because that's how she described it. Now, could he have said, you must be pro-life and not want to kill babies? He could have. But now he's put words in her mouth. It's true, isn't it? But again, it's not just about saying what's true, it's about how I say it. So, she says, I could never kill a baby. And so he responds, he says, in a very just nonchalant, matter-of-fact way, he says, oh, well, you couldn't kill a baby, but there are other people who might kill babies. Isn't that something that we should do something about? If all life is precious, right? Now, her response, she has kind of gone a little bit out of the talking points of this issue. And there are talking points on either side, by the way, so I'm not insulting her per se, although, again, we understand there is a correct and an incorrect view on this. She's kind of gone a little bit outside the talking points. But when he says that, there's a little bit of a challenge here, but still a very much a cordial conversation. Well, she goes back to the talking points now, right? Well, I believe women should have a choice. That's how she responds. Now, let's stop and think about that for a second. What does it mean to have a choice? And I'm not even talking about abortion specifically. If I say someone should have a choice, what does that mean? Okay, if there's a choice, oftentimes one choice is right, one choice is wrong, although not always, but yes. What else? What else does that mean? Does the phrase, they should have a choice, mean anything unless we define it? Something he points out in the course of this conversation, meaning for us, not he doesn't say this to her, but that doesn't really mean anything. I mean, we can't say that in certain circumstances, right? If we're talking about, me murdering my neighbor because they're annoying, and my neighbor's not annoying, by the way, I'm just using that as an example. But if we just say that, oh, well, they should have a choice. What, to murder someone, right? The circumstance completely changes this. So they should have a choice doesn't mean anything until we define it. And so that's what he picks up on. He says, okay, well, let's think about this for a second, because that doesn't mean anything. So he doesn't let her get by with that. He says, do you mean women should have a choice to kill babies? Now, notice, he's not attacking. He's not raising his voice. He's not doing anything like that. He's simply making conversation based on her own words. Now, is she getting uncomfortable at this point? Probably. But what's he doing? He's keeping this diplomatic. She says, well, I think all factors should be considered in cases like this. Yet another talking point. He asks, well, what factors are you talking about? Her immediate response, well, incest, right? And that's very common. Rape and incest are the go-tos when it comes to defending abortion. Now, we can talk about that, by the way, but you realize what she's doing. She's pro-choice in general because of the exceptions. That's not the same thing as saying there should be exceptions with rape and incest. No, I'm saying there should be, right? This is a whole other issue we can talk about. But she is building a case in the broad spectrum based on a little bitty minority of the cases. So he says, okay, so let me make sure that I understand your view. Now he's being very, very sincere about this. He wants to make sure he understands. He doesn't want to misstate her view. That accomplishes nothing for anyone. He says, let me make sure I understand your view. If a 2-year-old is standing next to me and they have been conceived as a result of incest, based on what you just said, I have the liberty to kill them. Is that correct? Now notice, that's what she has laid out. That is consistent with the view that she has laid out so far. What he has not done, he has not given that as an accusation. He has simply asked, would that be something you would agree with based on what you just said? He is genuinely trying to understand this. Now, he's also trying to steer the conversation in a way that she recognizes her viewpoint is not consistent. But he's being very intentional about how he does this so that he's not cutting the conversation off. Now, of course, her response, once again, she's on the defensive now. She says, I have mixed feelings about that. Now, I want you to think for just a moment. This woman has just said, not, I would be against murdering a 2-year-old. Now, he doesn't use the word murder, and neither does she, so that's not part of the conversation, but she's just said, I'd have mixed feelings about that, not, I'd be against it. What is that going to force her to do after this conversation is over? By the way, this is the end of the conversation. They're at checkout line, right? He sees that the line has gone long, and so he's like, I hope so. I hope you would have mixed feelings about it. Have a good day, he leaves. But what is she forced to do after this conversation is over? She just said, I would have mixed feelings about ending the life of a 2-year-old. Now, he never put those words in her mouth. She did all the work in this conversation when it really comes down to it. He just helped her to undermine her own position by the questions he asked. And notice, all he ever did was ask questions. But he asked questions that would put the ball in her court, that would force her to back up her own position, and that throughout the whole thing keeps a conversational, cordial tone, keeps everything diplomatic, not accusatory or any of that, because the point is not to win the argument. The point is to get her thinking. That's the kind of approach we're talking about whenever we talk about this idea of tactical diplomacy. So, I'm going to go ahead and we kind of did this as we went through. I wasn't sure how that would go, so I'm going to kind of go over this because it's kind of past time. But there are a lot of things he does in this conversation that are different from how Christians, I won't say we specifically, but Christians typically approach these kind of situations. A lot of what he just did is very, very simple for us to do. And we're going to learn as we move through here how to do this, how to just ask questions, how to let other people tell us why they believe what they believe. Notice, did he ever tell her his position on abortion? Does he have a position on abortion? Oh, yes. But that's not the point, because that's not going to be helpful. He is helping her to come to conclusions based on her own point of view, and ultimately that's going to be the best way for her to be taught. We've talked about before. You can give someone information, or you can help them come to conclusions for themselves. Which one sticks with you more? In anything, not just in religion. In anything. Now, let's ask one last question as we kind of wrap up. Is this manipulative? Is this approach a manipulative approach? That conversation, did it feel manipulative? Kind of, in some ways. Is that a problem? Why did it feel manipulative?
He's directing the conversation in a productive way.
Okay.
That's not how we usually talk to people.
Let's go back to Jesus. Does Jesus ever use these kind of leading questions?
Nearly every time.
Nearly every time. Was Jesus manipulative? Daddy's shaking his head yes, and in a sense, that's what we need to understand. By the way, the word manipulative, it comes from the word for hand. It literally just means you are shaping something the way it needs to be shaped. The word has become kind of dirty in our language, and understandably so. Here's what we need to understand about this approach. Can it be manipulative in a negative sense? Yes. Any teaching approach can be used manipulatively in the negative sense I'm talking now. So we, if we're going to use this type of approach, have to make sure, number one, we have the truth. We are telling the truth. We are getting them to an understanding of truth. And number two, that our character is right in this. We're not using this to try and get an upper hand. We're not using this to embarrass people. We're not using this in any way except this is an effective teaching technique that Jesus himself used and that we too can use. Yes, it can be misused, which is why we have a responsibility to use it properly. And never use it in any way to our own gain, never use it in any way for any other reason than to teach. But all teaching, using the word in the broadest sense, is manipulation. I am trying to shape a mind to get it from where it is to where it needs to be in whatever subject we're talking about. So when people encounter this type of conversation, if this ever comes up, if they say that's kind of manipulative, well, we need to think of what we're talking about here. By the way, you would ask them why. You wouldn't answer or defend. The proper response, just like anything else, would be to ask questions. Our goal in what we're talking about is to use our tactics with sincerity and with purpose so we can steer these conversations the right direction and help people see truths they have missed. We're going to go in very soon. I think we have maybe one more lesson before we get into some of the really specific things, but after next Wednesday, or Sunday, sorry, it's not Sunday. After next Sunday, we're going to start looking at 3 specific questions that we should always have in the back of our minds. Now, those questions get tweaked depending on the situation. But there are 3 basic questions that can be adjusted for the situation that will almost always allow us to do exactly this, to help us steer conversations the way they need to go and let the other person defend their belief and help them hopefully realize that there's something off in what they believe. And the beauty of this approach, as we conclude, is that anyone can do it. The 3 questions we're going to look at very soon, they're just simple questions that we ask many times without even recognizing it every day. But if done with purpose and intention, they can help us in our spreading of the gospel. You may not feel like you can sit down and have a Bible study with someone. You may not feel like you can get up in a setting like this and talk to a group of people. That's fine. You don't have to. You can just ask people questions in a conversation. Anybody can. And that's the beauty of this approach. As we wrap up, we're getting out of time. But I hope that this is helpful for us, both what we've looked at tonight and what we're looking at in general. As I've said before, I wish that I had come across this material way earlier than I did, because how to communicate with people in many ways is just as important as what to communicate with people. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand the truth is the truth, but if I don't communicate in a way that's effective that people will listen to, the end result is the same, is what I mean. So we'll wrap up there. If there is any way that we can help or assist you tonight, any way we can pray for you, encourage you, please let us know as we stand, as we sing together.
My Jesus,
I love